cities, because civilization is living in cities, and the foundation of Western civilization, or the particular city on which the culture was founded, and you could say there's several of them, but the most important of them is Jerusalem. Both in the real world, in the sense that pilgrims focused their attention on traveling to Jerusalem and praying there, but also in the imaginary world, that every city in the Middle Ages in Europe is to a certain extent modeling itself on that city, the heavenly city. And it's sort of paradoxical, because when we think about Christianity, which I would also say is the foundation of Western civilization, we think about the prayer practices that people are involved in. You think about a church, or you think about training the soul, but recognizing that all of those practices are imagined in a human environment, right? The city is the quintessential human environment. It's the made thing that we inhabit. So understanding Western civilization is understanding how precious and fragile and complicated cities are, and to understand that the civilization is also focused on the sense that there is a perfect city towards which we are also striving in this life. So this possibly will be an unpopular answer, but I think it's impossible to separate the distinctive achievements of Western civilization from the achievements of Christianity. And that makes it complicated to talk about Western civilization, because one of the great achievements of Christianity is recognizing the humanity of all human beings, right? That in Christ, as Paul says in Galatians, there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. And the paradox for Western civilization is that with that understanding of humanity, Western civilization is always looking to the rest of the world. So I think one of the things that we are challenged by in defining Western civilization is including the fact that Christians always look to all humanity as participating in the one true civilization towards which we hope we are tending with the heavenly city. With that sense, the particular achievements of European civilization include trying to model ourselves on that heavenly city and developing the art and support for the worship of God in that tradition. So when I look at the Middle Ages, I look at the cathedrals, I look at the universities, I look at the liturgy and the sacred art that's developed to support the worship of God. And for me, all of those are peculiar to our Western experience, but not necessarily definitive of Christianity, that Christianity is always looking to all human participation in the possibility of worshiping our Creator as we should. All of them. I mean, obviously I'm a professor, and therefore one of the things that I think is underappreciated is the way education is developed in Western civilization. That one of the myths that people tend to have about the Middle Ages is that the clergy had a monopoly on education, and in fact it's exactly the reverse, that the clergy and the monks are the ones who value reading and value learning in order to read, and it's by their example that lay people then want to learn to read. And one of the things that I've shown in detail in my scholarship is how medieval lay people, the not clergy, right, the every man, woman, and child, as it were, learn to read in order to learn to pray, as it were. So I suppose it as a very particular example, one of the things I think that's underappreciated is the reason we value literacy is because we value being able to speak well to God. Humility. Try making something yourself. Try making something complicated and that requires a high degree of skill, and then you will start appreciating what it took to make anything in our culture. I mean, that you can start. So one of the things that I actually do for my students in a number of my classes is give them the opportunity to make something. And I did this particularly of course, I taught on Mary and Mariology. We were talking through the theological problems of devotion to Mary, but I also gave them the option, if they didn't want to do a scholarly paper, to make a work of devotion. And one of the projects that one of my students did was to take paint a picture from a medieval manuscript, a Book of Hours, a prayer book for Mary, and copy it. And what she had to learn in order to copy that one little leaf was, all about pigments, all about, the skill that it took to make those designs, about the choice of the iconography. Once you've humbled yourself before a work of art or a law code or a historical text or something and tried to imitate it, then I think you will start appreciating the precious degree of complexity that we have in our own civilization. Yes, Christianity is absolutely essential to understanding Western civilization. I talked about how civilization in the West is founded on this idea of a city, and particularly focused on Jerusalem as the heavenly city. Christianity is critical to the sense of, well, worship and awe towards both our existing in this life, that we are creatures of a creator made in the image and likeness of this maker, and in the things that I've been talking about, the degree to which we're able to appreciate the skill that it takes to be a philosopher, think through arguments, to be an artist, to make beautiful objects. All of those are, in Christian terms, reflections of our being made in the image and likeness of a rational, loving maker. And to understand what Western civilization means, you have to understand how much of our great work was done with that appreciation of God as creator in mind. It's critical. Most of the things that I'm describing as central to Western civilization have their origins in the Middle Ages, the cities for one. I mean, that we think about city life as modeled on the Greek polis or on ancient Rome, but the way in which we understand civic life now is an artifact of the development of the city in the Middle Ages. The things like our legal system, so that we think of having rights. Those are the rights and privileges that were originally given by charter to the burghers of the medieval city. So if you want to understand our civilization, you have to start with the institutions like the cities that had their origins in the Middle Ages. Other institutions like the universities, the traditions of art and music that we have thanks to Christianity, all of these things are developed in the Middle Ages in ways that they may have roots in ancient practices, but the form that we have now in the West is still very much medieval. To give a very simple example, pop music, right? The kinds of songs that people listen to on the radio now have their long origin back in the songs of the 12th century with the troubadours, right? The love songs and the sort of the beauty of the beloved, and your frolicking in spring and so forth. That is, it's inconceivable to think about Western civilization without that romantic love element, and that is definitely an artifact of the medieval period. So when I teach my students at Chicago, that's my primary exercise, that you are imagining yourself into the perspective of the author at the time, so that you can, I mean, if you want to get historical knowledge out of a particular text, you can't do it unless you understood the purpose for which the author says he or she was writing, the way in which the circumstances of the day affect the kinds of things that the text tells you. And so even if you think that you're reading for purposes other than seeing through the other perspective, you can't get to those other purposes until you first appreciate why the text was written and its own assumptions, right? So, for example, one of the texts that I use in my History of European Civilization course is Beowulf. It's a famous medieval text, and everybody wants to know about the dragon, right? So if you've read or seen The Hobbit, don't watch the movie, you have the fire-breathing dragon, and that's a character directly from Beowulf. And one of the things that happened in the 19th century in reading Beowulf was the expectation that it could be used to imagine the pre-Christian life of the Anglo-Saxons. Well, once you realize that the author was writing as a Christian and writing about a culture and a sort of society that was hundreds of years gone, the entire poem is an exercise in nostalgia, and that then affects whether or not you think there were truly fire-breathing dragons in the Middle Ages. Well, The Lord of the Rings, not The Hobbit, but The Lord of the Rings, and on a number of layers. It certainly, Tolkien's reverence for the Middle Ages as a scholar obviously is present in his storytelling, right? And so I read The Lord of the Rings when I was growing up. I was 11 or so when I first read it, and that obviously helped feed my interest in studying medieval literature, learning more about things like Beowulf, learning medieval Latin. But in the long run, the reason that the book had the most effect on me is because of Tolkien's faith, right? That he wrote as a Catholic, and he told one of his friends, when a Jesuit who he's friends with, that the Lord of the Rings was a fundamentally Catholic work, unconsciously so in the beginning, but consciously in the revision. And as over my life, I've realized the number of times I've reread the book, the more and more I've gotten into an appreciation of what Tolkien meant by that, and it feeds back into that sense of being made in the image and likeness of a maker, right? That he understood he considered a sacramental view of the world, that we make in material terms because we're made in the image and likeness of a maker. And that's what he wanted to tell, he wanted to show in his stories with the joy that the characters take in making beautiful objects, right? But there's also a warning there, right? Because a beautiful object like the ring can become your precious if you're becoming too attached to it, right? And so he's also teaching lessons about not being too attached to the material world, and not being wanting so attached to the material world that you'll do things like kill for it, right? As Gollum did. And so I teach a course on Tolkien and the Lord of the Rings at Chicago to help students see through these different layers of the enjoyment of the story to the theological and moral lessons that it's trying to teach as well.